All right, I will be muted and videoed off. Good to know. Go ahead.
All right. Um, so today we're going to be talking about deception as it pertains to funding in computing. So some of you may have heard of Moore's Law. It's this law that states over a course of about a year and a half or 2 years, computers' speed will double, their cost will halve, and their size will halve. If you take that backwards, that means that the older computers, especially the really early ones, were unimaginably large, unimaginably slow, and horrifyingly expensive. As with anything state of the art, it costs a lot. And as with anything state of the art, you need a really good funding flow. Perhaps it's not surprising then that there were there were a lot of lies, a lot of tricks, and a lot of perhaps underhanded let's say deceptions made in order to get funding for interesting projects. Today we're going to be talking about a few of those, and Ethan's going to kick us off with some slides about one of the best known examples.
Yeah, we decided to do a kind of general tech look at through the years of these big old computers. So apologies that my webcam is flickering out. I tried two separate webcams, and this is still the result. But with the focus of this talk, big money, big lies, government funding, and computers, because computers aren't always used for what their stated purposes are. Let's put it that way. And I want to talk today specifically about the biggest computer ever built, Project Sage, the US government's largest research project and biggest fraud, question mark. So today, what we think of as computers are really experiences where you kind of sit down with an interface, you get real-time feedback, and generally you're accessing remote servers of information. This is a photo from the 90s, and maybe not everybody was on the internet yet, but it was coming. Everybody was looking in that direction. And a lot of people think this kind of dates mainly from the personal computer era once you get to the 1970s. Maybe not the online part, but before that, computers were big. They were the size of rooms, and they were all about punched cards and obscure interfaces, like this one, the IBM 1620. Don't worry, we won't get too much into model numbers in this. But what if I told you that in the 1950s, the largest computer that was ever built laid the groundwork for modern computer use, and it also made a mark on pop culture, plus set the stage for the internet. So it all starts at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, over in the Lincoln Laboratory. They created this experimental computer called Project Whirlwind. It was the first computer with real-time capabilities, as in you put in something and it would give you something straight back. You wouldn't have to wait for it to go through paper tape and all this stuff. It was a proof of concept both for the uses of real-time computing and also in kind of personal interfaces. You can see the woman sitting over there in front of the screen. It wasn't quite the same as what we're going to get into, but it was a way of bringing people closer to what computing put out. Project Whirlwind was funded with money from the Air Force, and several other projects started to apply that technology to flight tracking. However, this was also during the Cold War, and tracking potential Soviet air incursion was also on the minds of the US government. So in 1952, the government contracted with Lincoln Laboratories, Bell Laboratories, and IBM, all East Coast companies, to create a computer that would be part of a nationwide early air warning system to warn of Soviet bombers, especially Soviet nuclear bombers. And they called it the Semi-Automated Ground Environment, or SAGE. It's a very stretched acronym, but there you go. It's called Project SAGE. The outlay of this system was projected to be $2.4 billion just to build it, and then every year, $500 million in maintenance fees. And despite that price tag, it just really showing you the difference of the political times. In 1955, the project was pretty unanimously approved after a couple early tests that proved that the system would in fact work. The first SAGE system was installed at the McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. New Jersey is where Bell Laboratories was. And it took up the majority of this massive building. All the partners had a part to play, though IBM took a large part of the credit. They constructed most of the computer components, but everybody had something that they contributed to it. Lincoln Laboratory applied their work from Whirlwind on the computer interface. You can see a bunch of operators sitting here at these modified radar screens, which would be used to track the flights that they were, trying to intercept. And they interacted with the screen using these gun-shaped light pens. And basically, they were clicking on parts of the screen. This was a very early version of a graphical user interface, well before the famous one of Douglas Engelbart. And as more stations were set up around the US, they needed a way to talk with the centralized computer because you couldn't just build a new computer. Everything would just be chaos at that point. So Bell Labs engineer named John Harrington invented a device which would send digital information over the phone line. The Bell system being the phone line back in the 1950s. There was no alternative. And this device was called the modulator demodulator, or the modem, that thing in your house that you really hate. So a bunch of remote terminals could access and use the shared computer time at the central location, and they would later call this time sharing, which as it was developed later in the 1960s. Project Sage also featured huge leaps in computer graphics. Whirlwind had computer graphics, but this really took it to the next level. These were through vector graphics rather than the raster versions that we would see later, but this was basically the first version of a reactive interface. Now, as impressive as this computer was, it was criticized as an overexpensive solution to a very remote problem. There weren't tons of Soviet aircraft entering US airspace. And once ICBMs came into the picture, Sage didn't really have a response for that. You could intercept a plane, couldn't really intercept a missile. And more than that, some who worked on Project Sage claimed it never even served its purpose. Pictured here is Lester Ernest, who was later head of the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Project. He claimed that the entire thing was a complete scam, deception. The entire selling to the U.S. audience was that it was supposed to be able to track aircraft, and he says that it really did not. All the demos were just complete fakes. But whether or not it really served its intended purpose, Sage did help expand computer technology in some very tangible ways in research and application and in public awareness. You may have noticed a little something about the kind of aesthetic of the Project Sage war rooms, if we want to lead a little bit. And you can see that in the classic movie Doctor Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick, the war room scenes are directly inspired by the interfaces of Sage. IBM really used their head start in constructing Project Sage to dominate the world of batch processing-based computers with the punch cards and whatnot. They weren't really big on the interface part, but they dominated the early world of mainframe computers. And the designer of that interface for Sage was a guy who was participating through MIT named JCR Licklider. He was the primary mind behind the concept of the ARPANET, the precursor to the internet, which itself was started with a bunch of leftover Sage hardware that they were trying to put to use. So you can thank the internet on Project Sage, even if it wasn't really effective in what it was supposed to be. In computing history, Sage is a monument to the power of the US government and how rapidly digital technology advanced from its very humble beginnings on something like Whirlwind. So there's my quick little presentation of a certain type of deception, and we'll throw it back over to Sean and talk about a couple more projects in this
Yeah.
vein.
So just as something to add, another thing that JCR Licklider was super interested in was computer user interfaces. There's this great book called The Dream Machine, which is primarily about the development of Sage and Licklider's life. But he didn't really care about missile defense systems. One of the reasons he wanted to do the project outside of networking was to push the idea of human computer symbiosis, to figure out how do we get humans to more effectively use computers. It turns out that missile defense was one way to get money for that. Whirlwind also falls into the same trap here. Ethan, you had mentioned that it was initially funded by the Air Force. Do you know what their mission statement was from the outset?
Yes, they were trying to build a flight simulator.
And what did they not do?
They did not build a flight simulator.
Partway through the project, you can actually look through the memos. They just kind of stopped talking about building a flight simulator because the idea was the Air Force would give them all this money and they can make this adaptive flight sim where they could design a new plane in software, throw someone in a fake cockpit, and
Mhm.
get real world testing experience. But once they got funding, they just kind of dropped the idea when the grants are set in stone. They actually use Whirlwind besides as a proof of concept. They make games for it. There's this blackjack simulator. I think there's a few different versions that were written on Whirlwind, even though it's
Yeah,
supposed to
a
be like a
friend of
federal
mine
system.
has documented all of the games that were played on Whirlwind that you can see through. Like there were some declassified memos that came out, and MIT has them on their website. So there was at least like a dozen games made for this thing that was funded by the government.
That's tax dollars at work.
Hmm.
Um, I guess the other big one that we should touch on is Plato, right? So,
Plato, Plato, not the other version.
yeah, sadly, although pretty malleable.
Mm.
Plato was another one of these big shared computer network type systems, but was built at which university was it again?
University
Indiana,
of Illinois at
Illinois.
Urbana-Champaign.
So it's this educational system, and it gets grant funding specifically for educational terminals to do instant feedback testing and to do distributed learning. But it does get used for that. A lot of students quickly figure out that you can make video games with it. So there was this con they'd pull where any student could get an administrative account or account with enough access to write software if they said they wanted to make a lesson plan. So they'd go to administrators and be like, hey, I really want to make a lesson. Want to teach about dogs or something. And so they say, okay, we'll elevate your privileges. We'll let you program. They'd go, gee, thanks. And then they'd go back and write a video game and share it as their like dog learning lesson file. And that ends up being used repeatedly. And even when administrators find these games and shut them down, they'd have one of their buddies go to a different admin and be like, "Hey, I really want to write this, lesson plan about linear algebra. Can you give me some file space? Can you give me a better user account?" They'd be like, sure, that sounds fine. And then the same game would pop up again as like linear algebra homework file.
Yeah, it was a constant tug back and forth with the Plato admins because they did, in large part, passively approve of this just because they wanted people to use the system. And this is something that shows up all over the place when you're talking about computers, technology, and games. They really just want people to be comfortable with computers and not see them as the giant HAL 9000. So games is a particularly good way to do that.
But there is always a break-even point because I know at certain points Plato was almost entirely used for games, right?
Hmm.
Or at least to
Yes,
the exclusion of more official work.
yeah, they had to throttle a lot of the the sending of data back and forth. They had to write in specific programs that were going to prevent all of the things being used for games. Um, there was one particularly famous one called Airfight, which was a 3D flight simulator where you shot down other planes. And that used a ton of data, even though that the guy who wrote it did write in a restriction on like when this could be played during what hours. It was still just like a complete resource hog.
All right, does that take us up to time?
No,
Or we
we've got
got
plenty of more time.
okay.
There's
You
plenty of
have
other places we
about
can go with this.
five more minutes for discussion if you want. Audience members, if you'd like to add any questions to the chat, we can start asking them at that point, or you guys can keep rolling.
Yeah, feel free to send in the questions. We can just keep bouncing around some of this stuff. Like I mentioned the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Project, and one of the most famous things that happened there was a play of one of the very early computer games, Space War. They
Mhm.
held what is basically the first video game tournament in like formalized terms there. And what they did is they on their time sharing system, because they had all these separate terminals, they wrote a program that would use as few resources as possible to play Space War while other people were doing actual work.
Yeah, so kind of sneaking it in so no one notices, oh no, why are all these terminals tied up?
It was understood that these were being used for that purpose, but if they got in the way of like people trying to do
Mhm.
physics calculations, then they'd get a little miffed.
Coming back to ask a
Uh,
question here from T.E.
mhm.
Kalenda, isn't the original Turing test a game of deception?
Yeah, in a manner of speaking. Ethan, do you have thoughts on that?
I mean, it's a game in kind of an abstract sense because it is a test. It is seeing, and it's more of a philosophical concept than it is particularly a formalized game as such.
Turing also did write a lot about video games,
Mm.
surprisingly enough. There's this book of essays called Faster Than Thought. It's from the 50s, but it's about computer history. So not going very far back there. But there's this
Especially because they
Turing
didn't know
essay.
about Colossus at the time.
Yeah, there's this one essay in there that Turing wrote, which is talking about the state of games in general, but he spends a lot of time talking about chess and being like, oh, well, we're kind of close to maybe having a computer that can beat a human in chess, but we're not quite there yet. There's a number of similar essays that he wrote that are really interesting if you want to get that kind of perspective from Turing.
Yeah, and he basically, within my field, which is game history, he is basically the first person to come up with the idea of a digital computer playing a game. He and I'm forgetting the other chap's name, but they created this theoretical program called TuroChamp, or TuroCamp, I think, that was an outline for how you could program a chess playing algorithm, but they didn't have a computer strong enough to
Mhm.
run it at the time.
I do have to at least point out the irony that something like this was being funded to be an air sim or air detection system, only to turn into a game to do exactly
Oh
that.
yeah. There was also just really weird research going on Sage, one of the first graphical programming languages was developed on the system because you have a bunch of programmers, they have these interfaces, so they're going to do something with it. So some of them at MIT figured out that you could represent a program with like a flow chart, and you could draw the little flow chart using the
Hmm.
light guns and then execute that. Which, once again, that has nothing to do with missile defense. It's just we have all this money. We got to use it. We got to do something. We have to pay our salaries. So let's get busy.
Yeah, because the idea in with Sage is that it was supposed to be operating at all hours of the day and like make
Mhm.
sure that we keep uh our shores safe. But like there were a lot of pieces to it. The computer wasn't needed all the time. Even though there weren't really that many games written for Sage that I know of anyway, there were a lot of frivolous programs, including very famously some nudie art at one point.
Is this like ASCII type nudie art where it's all just
It's
Well, it
characters,
vector,
was
or
right?
Yeah, it was created with vector graphics, so everything's a line basically. But basically, they did a topless pinup woman as one of the very first like robust graphical images that was ever created on a computer.
I never heard about that. Is there a preserved image of that, perhaps, or
Yes,
is it
it gets shared
nice?
around the internet quite a bit. Obviously,
I'll need to
we're
look
supposed
that
to be
up.
family friendly here, but that is one of the legacies of Sage, as people know it on the internet today.
that doesn't surprise me at all, actually. That seems to be one of the first images that we need to produce in any type of
Mhm.
medium. So it goes with the territory.
Repressed computer scientists will get up to a whole lot of things if you let them.
So where do you think this could have gone? if it wasn't just a big scam, where do you think like this could have gone? If there was more, because obviously the notion or the habit of people taking time to use computer technology to build games instead of what they're supposed to be doing is a time-honored tradition that we all
Mhm.
remember from our high school computer labs and whatnot. If we shifted that energy towards detection, like how close would they have gotten at that time?
Well, they would have had to at least totally change how they were doing radar, right? Because as the threat moved from aircraft to missiles,
Mm,
you have to be looking up instead of out. I think that would be
okay.
like one of the fundamentals from what I understand.
And they did continue to iterate on these sort of ideas with future projects, like very famously what
Well, Star
gets
Wars.
colloquially called Star Wars. Yeah, the that was a combination of NASA science and computer technology and all these advances to see if we could stop missiles from destroying us. And there's really just no feasible way that, at least at the time, that they were able to figure out what they could do with that. Um, so at best, even if it worked, it could have, stopped some of the few times when Soviet aircraft got into US airspace, but that was barely anything. Top Gun lied to you. It didn't really happen that often.
I think fundamentally, if the energy was spent on only serious pursuits, we wouldn't have had things like the ARPANET as quickly, or we wouldn't have had such advances in computer graphics. We would have had
Right.
probably a much more boring future.
That's a fair point.
Recreation makes us drive towards things, so
What a humanist argument. We could talk about the Renaissance in a parallel with at the advent of
okay.
computing.
Yeah.
Yeah, finally get Bree's expertise in here.
I mean,
So how
fundamentally, folk are always the same, right?
mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Are there any other questions for our panelists? Put them in the chat now. We've got about 10 minutes left. So, how does something like this go from having this amount of funds and resources and space and staff go from that to like a to the decommissioning? And where do those people go? And do they have an extended legacy in the history of what comes next for computing, or was this sort of like a when it was done, it was done?
People who worked on Sage like went all over the place because basically
Mhm.
everybody who was a computer scientist at the time, and if they,
Mhm.
so a lot of them stayed at MIT, a lot of went to Stanford. I mentioned Lester Ernest before, and the other MIT people like John McCarthy, who helped put together the time sharing project at MIT, which like made computers accessible to
Mhm.
a
Time
wider
sharing's an
range
older term for multitasking, just for
Mm-hmm.
context
or the
there.
cloud,
Or the
if you want
cloud.
to put it in a certain way.
There's
The
also a lot of people, well, not a lot. Some of the people who worked on Sage from MIT found this thing called the MITRE Corporation, which is
mm,
a government spook research outfit. It's kind of like the RAND Corporation. So there
Mm-hmm.
is like a pipeline of all of these undergrads are getting their graduate degrees. They get all of this wildly cool real world experience and government clearance. And then they
Mm.
go and make these like government cutout agencies, which end up contributing a lot to like defense research and inadvertently things like I forget if MITRE is where email came from, but there's big systems like email that come out of some of these organizations that are kind of legacies from
Mm-hmm.
Sage employees.
yeah, I mean the ARPANET stuff, like it mostly gets concentrated in what becomes the ARPANET.
Hmm.
There's lots of steps along the way in there, but a lot of the what was Sage turns into the ARPANET, which becomes the
Hmm.
internet.
It's also important to realize timeline wise, the first PhDs in computer science are issued in 1964. And this is going on in the 50s into the early 60s. So this is pretty foundational to like, what does it mean to be a computer scientist? What does it mean to be a programmer that's not just like a mathematician that touches a computer sometimes?
Mm-hmm.
And also in terms of the hardware, the stuff from Whirlwind, Sage is an offspring from Whirlwind, and then there's a whole lot of other uh, things that come off of Whirlwind, but are taking some stuff from Sage, um, like what eventually becomes the Digital Equipment Corporation, which was kind of the pioneer in smaller computer systems, mini computers,
Smaller.
and yeah, smaller. They were drawer sized instead of building sized.
Well, the PDP
So
one, the Deck Corporation, their first computer is the PDP one, and it can fit through a doorway, but it is still massive. They have a working one down at the Computer History Museum in the Bay Area, and you can go
Mm.
stand by it, and it's a little bit taller than I am. It's it's about a wall worth of equipment instead of a room, but
bigger than
it's
a fridge you'd
smaller.
have at home.
Yeah, bigger than a fridge, smaller than a an RV, perhaps.
Yeah, rather famously, the PDP-8, they packed it into the back of a car, and that was their way of advertising that it
Yeah,
was like the smallest computer ever
wild
built, even
change.
though it's still like 500 pounds.
So what's the biggest, because we still have time, what's the biggest
Yeah.
shift in how computers are constructed and how that computing process changes to actually changing the size of a computer?
Oh, silicon.
Oh, okay.
Like 100%. Once silicon ICs come out to actual
Mhm.
microchips, that
Yeah,
blows
little
away
chips.
every technology before
Mm,
it.
hmm.
Um, Especially once we start getting to the point where we can put a lot of transistors on a chip, um, there's no going back. That's when computers become resoundingly cheap, resoundingly small, and you can just keep making them faster by putting more and more transistors on your little chip. And that's kind of that wave we've been riding into the modern day.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine because you just imagine a computer as a series of chips. But
Mhm.
like the reason Sage was as big as it was is because there was no chips. They were vacuum tubes.
Yeah.
It wasn't even transistors. It was vacuum tubes, giant glass tubes that needed to be a certain size in order for them to carry the bits of information that they were
Well, and
spitting
there's
out.
also all
So,
the logistics around tubes because vacuum tubes,
yeah, they get
to get
hot.
technical, yeah, they function using this thing called the thermionic effect, which the technical reason it works doesn't matter, but they have to be like hundreds of degrees.
Mm, mm,
So the tube itself isn't that like super big, but to have an air channel, you end up with a space about the size of your fist, where you have the tube in the middle and then space for air to flow around it, plus a socket and all the hookups for it. So
right.
space really becomes an issue really quickly with vacuum tubes. They're
Hmm.
also glass, so they just break sometimes. And if they overheat, they can burn out like a light bulb. We don't have those issues with silicon just because it's
Right.
such a fundamentally different technology.
So
Yeah.
does,
So, oh, go ahead.
no, you go ahead. I can wait.
I was I was just gonna say that chips enabled like real computers to be used by NASA, for instance,
Mhm.
because like I mean the smallest computer built up to the time it was built was the NASA flight computer, which was like it was on
Yeah,
the
the
arm
Apollo
of the
guidance
the astro
computer.
yeah, the Apollo guidance computer, and it was just like you would never have been able to even do a simple like calculator interface if you didn't have integrated circuits chips
Hmm.
Mhm.
like that.
Well, that answers one of my questions, which was going to be tying this to the space program. Does
Yeah,
Sage
there's
still
a
go ahead?
oh, go ahead. Just the yeah, it, I think that there is a good amount of actual equipment that was salvaged from Sage. Some of it was salvaged for the ARPANET, but then I think some of that did go to NASA as well, even though that's not what they were using when Apollo 11 actually launched because they had better technology that they could build by that time. I think
Hmm.
basically, these screens basically modeled what you would see in the control
Mhm.
center in
Hmm.
Well,
for
those
NASA.
those same, so specifically, the Sage terminals use this thing called a Charactron tube, which is one of those great mid-century tech names. But they're also smaller versions are used for some of the first computer-generated graphics,
Okay.
just because they're pretty good at high-resolution graphic displays. So they have this really stupid machine. It's kind of a hack where it's a dark box where they have one of these tubes salvaged, and then they just point a camera at it, like a reel-to-reel camera, and they
Mm,
just take a photo, change what's on the screen, take another photo, and then run that through, and you end up with an animation on the other side.
right. So does Sage still exist in any like could you have the Sage program now, or is that not a possibility?
Are there
They decommissioned
emulators?
most of the central like processing. One, it was made in a building, so
Mm-hmm.
they don't
Multiple
Mm-hmm.
store
buildings.
that
Yeah.
build. Yeah, and there were the remote terminals and whatnot, but the main computer was in one building, and they're not
Mm-hmm.
using it for that anymore. If it's still around, I don't actually know that. There are a couple
Mhm.
terminals that exist that are
Right.
in museums and things like that, but you could not piece it back together if you tried because
Mhm.
it was just too huge.
I know
There's
the
a
computers are IBM Federal Systems, which I'm pretty sure there's emulation for, but I haven't
hmm,
seen anything on people trying to emulate Sage itself. Um, yeah, like Ethan was saying, there are preserved artifacts in museums. There's a couple computer museums have these terminals, which actually, fun fact, they have ashtrays built into them,
Of
just because of
course.
the time
I didn't know
period.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that sounds about
no,
right.
that down in Mountain View, CHM, they have one with the a little sign by the ashtray. I know some of the mainframe computers are at least partially preserved, and I've seen some museums that have like models of installations, but a lot of the hardware just got decommed or
Mm-hmm.
scrapped.
Mm. I wonder how large or how many chips you would actually need to run the Sage program now as a
Oh,
comparative.
none.
Like it would
Yeah,
Basically
be.
yeah.
none. Yeah.
Like, I mean, you could run it in a browser without even have
Mhm.
to put out to another
Yeah, the
computer
computers from
system.
this era were so simplistic and they had such a small amount of memory that was used. We're
Hmm.
talking like thousands of bits, which is nothing. You could barely load a tweet into these computers' memory, if that
Like
dates the reference.
I like the comparison I saw once, the Deep Blue, which was the computer that eventually, beat a chess master. That power is it a phone beats it like several times over. A
Mm,
Yeah.
conventional
mm.
smartphone.
Yeah, it would
And
be an
part of that
And
is
that was
what's
in the
so
interesting.
fun.
90s.
Well, there you go. It would be interesting to see that display comparison. Here's the whole building we used to use for this, and here's like the small chip that
Mhm.
would run it today. Here's the tweet that matches the space count, or
Mhm. There's a bunch of
Yeah.
infographics like that you can find
mm-hmm.
online. Um, yeah, just the scale change, just
Mm-hmm.
without any other context, is wild to consider, I think.
Okay, shifting slightly because we just have about 5 minutes left for questions. So I want to know what what's next for both of you. What are you most excited to cover in the next aspect of computing and gaming history?
You want to take that, Ethan? Because I have an easy answer already.
Hmm. I have a book that is in the works that will be published soon, so I am excited for that. Covering arcade game companies of the 70s and 80s, a dramatic story of technology and fun and corporate backstabbing, a little bit of that as well. So that will be that's my main thing. For my YouTube channel, Play History. I do need to get back to covering the very early games, so I'll be getting to 1974 in the nearest future. I also over at Gaming Alexandria, where I'm an editor, we are also doing an induction of important games that we do every year, the video game notables. So I'll be streaming that. So feel free to follow me if you're interested in all that stuff.
Excellent.
I'm going to another conference next week. I'm
Yeah.
Not one on
there's
Zoom.
No, this is in person. There's this thing called the Vintage Computer Festival, which is this federated series of festivals for vintage computer nerds like us. But I'm going down to the SoCal chapter, which is down, it's actually right next to Disneyland, next weekend, which I'm super excited about. I'm going to be
Excellent.
talking about some software restoration I've been doing because outside of the podcast, when I have some extra time, which is rare these days, I like doing software restoration, where you have a little bit of software that exists and you have documentation, but you can't run the software anymore. So I go in and you can do a little bit of work. It's a good like weekend and a six pack of beer project usually, and you can get this old archival software running. And so I'm going to be speaking about some animation software I restored, and then
Amazing.
yeah, it's some cool stuff. It
Hmm.
actually uses those character on tubes we were talking about, or the real version did. My fake version just uses a laptop. I'm going to be doing an interview on stage, going to be running a panel, going to be on a panel, and just really enjoying the weekend. VCFs are really, really a good time if you're at all interested in this kind of stuff.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
A lot of
Mhm.
nerds in the room.
Oh yeah.
There's just a lot of nerds in this room. What are we talking
Yeah.
about? Well, this seems like a great place to wrap everything up. Thank you so much to our panelists. That was fantastic. And for
Yep.
those of you who are
Yeah,
sticking
thanks for
around for our
moderating.
next panel, we're just a couple minutes away. So if you have any further questions for Ethan or Sean, you can always ask in the general lobby chat, and or come to the after party and bring your questions there.
Thanks for coming by. Thanks, Bree. And
Yeah, thanks so
thank you,
much.
Intelligent Speech.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you later.